The highest seat of authority for the Sikhs, the Akal Takhat in Amritsar, saw a great shift in power on the morning of the 12th of October 1920. A society of radical reformist Sikhs called the Khalsa Biradari stormed into the Akal Takhat to displace the residing priests. Days later, a near full-scale scuffle erupted, where the once historic custodians of the Akal Takhat, the Akali Nihangs, were instigated by the priests to dislodge the Khalsa Biradari's coup. The radically egalitarian Khalsa Biradari, largely comprised of lower caste Sikhs, came out victorious. This was one of the most pivotal moments in Sikh history. What followed was the rise of a new order, marked by the establishment of the Shiromani Gurdwara Parbandhak Committee and the Shiromani Akali Dal. These two organisations today, working in tandem, have by a great measure been instrumental in shaping much of the Sikh story of the 20th century. Holding most of Punjab's historical Gurdwaras, they are at present the most powerful Sikh institution in the world. They have come to define the Sikh form of protest against the powers that be, from the aftermath of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre against the British to the Dharam Yudh Morcha on the eve of 1984 against the Indian state. More recently, the nature and methods of the farmers' protests against the central government can be better understood by examining the legacy of the early Akali Dal. This documentary will examine the birth and political ascendancy of these two organisations in the backdrop of the British Empire. How did these new orders displace the traditions which previously dominated the Sikh scene? How did the battle between moderates, radicals, extremists, and militants like the Babbar Akalis play out within these tumultuous years? How much power does the post of the Akal Takhat Jathedar currently have? And how can we use this to understand the recent assassination attempt on the life of Sukhbir Singh Badal? This documentary will highlight the most consequential and defining chapter in the creation of modern Sikhism, which has since set the precedent for all what was to follow in the 20th century. This is the story of the new Akalis. To recap from our previous episode, we explored the state of Punjab's Gurdwaras at the dawn of the 1920s. Since the fall of Khalsa Raj, many of Punjab's Gurdwaras came to be largely run privately by a class of Mahants and Pujaris, who were provided patronage by the British. These Mahants and Pujaris very frequently belonged to the traditional orders of the Udasis and Nirmalas, who had gained popularity during the 19th century. The British maintained a tighter grip, however, over key shrines, including the Darbar Sahib complex, which they initially governed by direct control and later shifted to a more administrative structure in the way of a deputy commissioner and underneath that a manager. In fact, shortly after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, the manager, or Mahant, of Darbar Sahib, Arur Singh, presented General Daya with a saropa and commended the general for his actions. Between 1870 and 1920, a new generation of Sikhs, inspired by the legacy of the Singh Sabha movement, became increasingly disillusioned with what they saw as a corrupt and decadent system controlling Sikh shrines. The dominant ideological force of the Lahore Singh Sabha, and then the Chief Khalsa Diwan-inspired Sikhs, resented the fact that Sikhs from lower caste backgrounds were being restricted entry into the Darbar Sahib complex, documented in certain sources as past the fourth step, and others including references of their barring at certain entry points into the shrine. They also objected to the presence of idols and commercial activities in the shrine's vicinity. It was reported that local rogues, thieves and bandits would congregate and assemble within the temple's premises for the occasions of Holi and Basant. Pornographic literature was freely sold, and brothels were found close by. Rampant corruption plagued the management of daily affairs within the temple, largely driven by the reduction of priests' wages over the years, fueling bribery and the need for priests to work additional jobs. For many years, the moderate British loyalist Chief Khalsa Diwan under Sundar Singh Majitiya strove for Gurdwara reform. Despite having a symbiotic relationship with the British, the Chief Khalsa Diwan failed to weaken the colonial regime's relationship with the Mahants and Pujaris. Years of frustration over lack of Gurdwara reform, combined with the plague, famine, the First World War, and a growing All India freedom movement, saw a radical anti-British strain of Sikh politics brewing, which moved from strength to strength. By 1920, they were ready to disrupt the status quo of Sikh loyalists. The events of Jallianwala drew many Sikhs towards the first outright Sikh political party, called the Central Sikh League. Before the formation of the Central Sikh League, several prominent court cases had already addressed the issue of Gurdwara reform in specific areas. The most notable of these was the case involving the Singh Sabha of Peshawar, who mounted a legal battle against the Mahant of Akali Fulla Singh's shrine, a shrine originally built in the northwest frontier province by Maharaja Ranjit Singh. The Peshawar Singh Sabha accused the Mahant of dubious character and of selling land associated with the shrine to fund his personal lifestyle. After years of legal battles, this ultimately led to his removal and the establishment of a new committee to manage the shrine. This victory inspired other Singh Sabhas across Punjab to pursue similar cases against the Mahants. However, it soon became clear that the cost of these legal battles, spread across vast territories, were often too high to sustain. The Central Sikh League, however, had a radically new approach, for their strength relied heavily on their daily publication, the Akali newspaper. Popular opinion pieces, opined by Sundar Singh Layalpuri, Sardar Mangal Singh Gill, and Master Tara Singh, found their way into the homes of Sikhs all over the Punjab. The Akali editors had begun publishing tracts against the moderate Chief Khalsa Diwan, questioning whether they really served Sikh interests. They regularly derided the Chief Khalsa Diwan's strategy of remaining loyal to the British and expressed their disdain at the Chief Khalsa Diwan for having sided against the Ghaddarite movement. The Akali newspaper then turned its attention to the Mahants of Punjab and encouraged Sikhs to organise into local jathas with the aim of overthrowing individual Mahants via non-violent agitation. Inspired by the editorials of the newspaper, these jathas came to be branded the Akalis, though they should not be conflated with the traditional order of the Akali Nihangs. These new Akalis instead wore black turbans and were very often clad in black, carrying kirpans, and this soon became a symbol of political defiance amongst civilians, the aristocracy, and the military. In the summer of 1920, Amar Singh Jabbal led the recruitment of a Shahidi Jatha at a divan hosted by the Central Sikh League. Over 700 members of the Sangat were recruited for the Rakabganj agitation. Covered in our previous episode, it ultimately resulted in the government rebuilding the demolished wall of the Gurdwara before the Shahidi Jatha had arrived. The Rakabganj agitation's success saw a surge of many other Jathas across Punjab, with the most popular being the Akali Jatha Khada Saudabar, spearheaded by the radical Jathedar Kartar Singh Jabbar. Many of these Akali Jathas had a strength in the thousands, and they were organised and led by a middle-class educated corps, with their respective leader being anointed the title of Jathedar. Gaining momentum, the idea of overthrowing the Mahants of Darbar Sahib, once a dream, now started seeming more of a reality by the day. It was instead an organisation named the Khalsa Biradri, which arose to the occasion to undertake this endeavour. If you remember in our previous episode, we mentioned that the Society of Lower Caste Sikhs, the Khalsa Biradri, was supported by the Chief Khalsa Diwan. They held an open meeting at Jallianwala Bagh in October 1920. Both the Chief Khalsa Diwan leader Sundar Singh Majitiya and Akali Jathedar Kartar Singh Jabbar were present. Here the Khalsa Biradri converted many lower caste attendees to Sikhi through Khande Di Paul, and they led them on a procession from Jallianwala Bagh to the Harmandir Sahib. Full of zeal, in their thousands they arrived and urged the Mahants and Pujaris to accept Kada Prasad from them as equals in faith, and that the Kada Prasad should then be distributed amongst the whole Sangat. The Mahants and Pujaris of Harmandir Sahib up until then had refused to accept Kada Prasad from lower caste Sikhs and rejected their request. After a long discussion, Bhai Fateh Singh, who is the head Pujari Granthi of Harmandir Sahib, and Jathedar Kartar Singh Jabbar, who advocated on behalf of the Khalsa Biradri, compromised with one another and decided that it would be best to obtain a Hukamnama from the Guru Granth Sahib. The Hukamnama was claimed to be more in tune with the egalitarian vision of the Khalsa Biradri, which in turn made the Granthi accept the distribution of Kada Prasad from lower caste Sikhs. Immediately after, the Khalsa Biradri then marched towards the Akal Takhat, and on seeing this, the Pujaris within the Akal Takhat fled. The government-appointed manager Sundar Singh Ramgarhia had earlier ordered them to stay put. 25 Sikhs from the procession now formed a new committee to take charge of the Akal Takhat, with a new Akali Jathedar, Teja Singh Putchar, being assigned command of the Takhat. It's important to note that Teja Singh was anointed in as the first Jathedar of the Akal Takhat, a newly established position at this point. In response, the British set up their own 9-man ad hoc committee of reformers, who were led by Sundar Singh Ramgarhia, This British committee of reformer Sardars took charge of the shrine at this point. In the days which followed, the disgruntled Pujaris who had lost control of the Takhat called upon the Nihangs of the Buddha Dal to fight against the reformers. Tensions reached fever pitch on the night of the 15th of October. The attack, however, never followed through. Babbar Akalis of Patti had dissuaded the Nihangs from mounting a pitched battle. It's important to note that these events of the night of the October 15th, as widely recorded in most academic sources, differ in a few sources published later. One alternate version is found in a book published in 1959 on the life of Kartar Singh Jabbar, later republished in English by the SGPC. According to this account, the displaced Pujaris overseeing the Akal Takhat instigated the Nihangs at Burj Akali Fulla Singh in Amritsar to seize control of the Akal Takhat, which they subsequently took over at midday, with no reformers being present. They were eventually ousted on the arrival of various Akali Jathas and a woman, Bhajan Kaur, who reportedly beat the Akali Nihang Jathedar and others, forcing them to eventually leave the Takhat. However, Nihang oral accounts, as documented by Kamal Roop Singh, challenged this version. These oral accounts claim that the Akali Jathas included the presence of many women who aggressively confronted the Nihangs. Unwilling to retaliate against women, the Nihangs chose to leave. The oral Nihang accounts further allege that Jathedar Kartar Singh Jabbar speared the Dasam Granth and threw it from the second floor of the Akal Takhat. Notably, there is no evidence of this claim being corroborated by any other written source. There is evidence that after 1920 the Dasam Granth was removed from the Akal Takhat, with its prior presence at the site being documented in various sources. There is also documentation of a separate incident in a heavily casteist source of 1923, titled Missi Jat Ki Kartoot, written by a Pujari of the time. The Pujari author continuously expresses disdain for lower caste Sikhs, whom he accuses of polluting the Gurdwaras in reform. This source describes the desecration of the Dasam Granth at Ramsar Gurdwara. The perpetrator is identified as an Ingrez Granthi, potentially implying a reformist Sikh, but the details of this remain unclear. Almost a month later, on the night of Diwali, the Nihangs had planned another attack. On this occasion, the Akali Jathedar in charge of the Akal Takhat challenged Nihangs on a trial to strength. The Nihangs withdrew from taking up this challenge. The leadership of the Pujaris was thus forth no more over the Akal Takhat and the Darbar Sahib complex. For many generations, the Akal Takhat was governed by a coalition of Pujaris and Akali Nihangs. The Akali Nihangs had been the political and spiritual custodians of the shrine from the times of the Gurmatas in the 1700s, and it was here, one of the 4 Takhats, where they bestowed Khande Deepal on new converts. Remnants of historic Akali Nihang practices continued up to the point of the takeover, and Sundar Singh Ramgarhia, the manager, describes the chatka of goats in front of the Takhat occurring on Dussehra, along with Pang being prepared behind the Akal Takhat on the eve of the takeover by the Khalsa Biradri and the new Akalis. The Akali Nihangs had now been usurped by the new reformist Akalis. The new Akalis were now on a political mission to take control of all of Punjab's Gurdwaras. These new Akalis shared their hukamname far and wide. They persuaded premier Sikh bodies to send their representatives to the Akal Takhat to resolve the affairs of the Gurdwara management. The Central Sikh League, the political party of the new Akalis, invited delegates and representatives from all 4 Takhats, different Sikh associations, Khalsa colleges, Sikh princely states, Sikh regiments and cavalries, and different Nihang Jathas to gather for the assembly of a new representative Gurdwara committee to lead the Panth. Concerned with the potential influence of this new Gurdwara committee, 2 days prior to the gathering, 36 members, including Maharaja Bhupinder Singh of Patiala and Sundar Singh Majithia of the Chief Khalsa Diwan, preemptively met the governor of Punjab to form their own committee in an attempt to weaken the influence of this new body. To secure the support and legitimacy of the colonial authorities, the Central Sikh League compromised with the British, and it was agreed that the 36-member British Committee of Loyalists would be incorporated into their own newly formed elected committee. This would place the overall size up to 175 members. The 15th and 16th of November 1920 saw a gathering of 12,000 at a Sarbat Khalsa, with the Sangat dressed in black, the Akali attire, for the inauguration of the 175-member combined committee. It was here where the name the Shiromani Gurdwara Parbandhak Committee, the SGPC, came to be. The moderate pro-British loyalist Sundar Singh Majetia was elected as its president. The British ensured that the loyalist manager Sundar Singh Ramgarhia, who succeeded manager Arur Singh, held the keys to the shrine. He continued to work under the Deputy Commissioner. The SGPC ensured strict criteria was maintained for the representative committee members of 175, and this included being initiated with Khande Paul, being a regular reader of the scriptures, possessing the 5 Ks, being an early riser, and giving a tenth of one's income towards a Panthik cause. In its early months, the British overlooked the more radical elements of the SGPC and were in favour of the committee's loyalist leadership. The SGPC at this point were considered moderate and outlined a strictly religious objective. There were no key Akali Jatha leaders amongst the SGPC's leadership core following the committee's inauguration. And because of this, the British remained open to the idea of Gurdwara reform across the Punjab, moving along constitutional lines. The British were able to exert their influence over the SGPC via their 36 loyalists. In a continuation of the post-Khalsa Biradari takeover, Teja Singh Puchar would continue to serve as the first Jathedar of the Akal Takhat after the Sarbat Khalsa gathering. From then on, this position would be filled by the SGPC nomination. A month later saw the formation of a separate organisation called the Akali Dal. The different Akali Jathas, with their respective Jathedars, came together to form a centralised unit. 5 individuals per 100 from each Akali Jatha were invited into the Akali Dal, and this centralised body aimed to coordinate a more unified way of taking control of the rest of Punjab's Gurdwaras. The Akali Dal leaders were enthused by the success of the SGPC, and they aimed to work alongside them. Not long after, they fell into the SGPC's remit, but they still very much functioned independently. They were instead openly hostile to the British and aligned with India's broader non-cooperation movement. It's important to note that during this fluid period, there is evidence of disagreements in policy between the Akali Dal, the SGPC, and the Akal Takhat Jathedar. In particular, early on, the Akali Dal were very much in favour with the non-cooperation movement against the British, in contrast to the moderate SGPC. The Akali Jathas maintained a radicalism of trying to seize Gurdwaras by non-violent agitations. Just prior to the Akali Dal's formation, Jathedar Kartar Singh Jabbar and his Jatha of Akalis had taken over Panja Sahib Gurdwara after facing fierce violent resistance from the Mahants of Hassan Abdul. In the months which followed, the Akali Dal led a series of successful campaigns and overthrew the Pujaris of some of Punjab's most historic Gurdwaras. Some notable smaller Gurdwaras include Chomala Sahib in Lahore, Khada Sauda and Kaur Sahib at Nankana, Chola Sahib in Ludhiana, and Gurdwara of Shikkapur and Khadur Sahib near Amritsar fell into the hands of the SGPC. Darbar Sahib in Tarantaran, which is one of the most famous Gurdwaras in Majha, soon fell in January 1921, and here 2 Akali Jatha members were killed and 17 were injured. The Nankana Sahib Gurdwara in modern-day Pakistan, the birthplace of Guru Nanak, is said in sources to be one of the worst affected in terms of Gurdwara etiquette. It was run by a series of Udasi Mahants, with Mahant Narrate Das being in charge at the start of the 1920s on the formation of the SGPC and Akali Dal. A series of allegations have been listed in various sources, highlighting his hedonistic lifestyle. This includes alcohol consumption, dancing girls being invited to the Gurdwara, and his affair with a Muslim drummer's wife inside the Gurdwara premises. He is also said to have turned a blind eye to other pujaris sexually molesting females within the Gurdwara. In response, the Akalis held a large divan in Tarovali, vowing to take over Nankana on the back of the success of capturing the Harmandir Sahib complex. Worried about the mobilization of the Akali Jathas and the potential for Nankana Sahib to fall under the SGPC, a meeting was held between the Udasi Mahant Narrate Das and other Udasis, Nirmalas, Bedis and Sodis, largely of the old traditional orders we've discussed in one of our previous episodes. Kartar Singh Birdi, the nephew of Guru Khem Singh Birdi of the Amritsar Singh Sabha, played a prominent role at this event. A Sanatan Gurdwara Committee was set up in direct competition to the reformers' own SGPC. At this event, 60,000 rupees were collected to fund a Sant Sevak weekly newspaper to be distributed for free to run tirades against the reformers. Udasi Mahant Narayan Das, at this point, also hired 400 goons of his own. The SGPC set about a motion inviting the Panth as a whole to convene on the 4th, 5th, and 6th of March at Nankana Sahib to defy the authority of the Mahant. A subcommittee including the high-profile Jathedar Kartar Singh Jabbar was formed as a task force to organise this event. Jabbar was more radical in his approach and wanted to forcibly occupy the shrine prior to this event, which was rejected by others. Within this period, it was reported by Sir John Maynard, a Home Member of the Punjab government, that the information in possession of the Punjab government indicated an intention on the part of the Mahant to prevent the shrine and its enclosures from being rushed by an attacking party. C.M. King of the Punjab Legislative Council, who was the Lahore Division Commissioner, added to this by saying that the Mahant had begun to collect weapons with which to defend himself from the attack planned on him. The official policy of the British authorities was to avoid interference in Gurdwara disputes. They nonetheless were concerned about the pace of radicalism and reform which was sweeping Punjab. C.M. King held a meeting with Mahant Narayan Das and provided him with legal advice. He had also previously assured Kartar Singh Birdi in a letter that any person who attempts to eject forcibly any Mahant is liable to punishment under the criminal law. The British authorities were aware of the fortifications and preparations, as has been uncovered in their fortnightly correspondence with the Mahant. With the large-scale gathering looming in March, the Mahant absconded from various planned negotiations with Kartar Singh Jabbar. He instead hired further mercenaries, along with 100 Pathans under the leadership of Ismail Party. The Mahant was also said to have planned the assassination of the top Akali leaders at the SGPC event in March. Jabbar, receiving this news from informants, decided instead on a radical maneuver of forcibly occupying the shrine. At the time, the Mahant was busy at a Sanatani Sikh conference on the 19th and 20th February. In an Akali meeting during this time, however, Master Tara Singh and other prominent Akalis decided against occupying the shrine until March. Jathas, including Kartar Singh Jabbar, were stopped en route to the forceful occupation. The one Jatha which continued was under the leadership of Bhai Lachman Singh, who stated that their intention was to only enter the shrine peacefully, as opposed to taking it over. The Mahant, who, on the news of the Jatha moving towards Nankana, returned from the Sanatani conference and instead saw this as their attempt to take over the shrine. As soon as the Jatha entered the Gurdwara, the gates were shut behind them. A hail of bullets tore through the Jatha, igniting a massacre. The public prosecutor, Mr. H.A. Herbert, described the scene in a statement. Firing started almost as soon as the Akalis entered the Gurdwara. Not a single syllable was addressed to them. They were fired upon without parley or question. No bodies were found, as the Mahant had ordered their quick cremation to remove all evidence. The Mahant, his confidants, and 26 Pathans were arrested, and the keys of the Gurdwara were immediately seized by the authorities. The Gurdwara was placed under military guard. Sometime later, Kartar Singh Jabbar arrived on scene, with 2,200 members of his Jatha. Feeling the pressure of the growing unrest, the Deputy Commissioner handed over Nankana Sahib's keys to the Akali Jathedar on the condition of the formation of a new committee to look after the Gurdwara's affairs. News of the Nankana Sahib tragedy unfolded and had swept the nation, receiving widespread condemnation. Jathedar Kartar Singh Jabbar stated that the happening had awakened the Sikhs from their slumber and the march towards Swaraj had quickened. In its aftermath, Indian nationalist leaders showed their solidarity with the Akali Sikhs by visiting the site. Gandhi went on to call the passive suffering of the Akalis as an act of national bravery, stated that the massacre was a second edition of Dairism, which was even more barbarous, calculated, and fiendish than that of the Dairism of Jallianwala Bagh. Maulana Shaukat Ali of the Khilafat movement publicly declared that the government was responsible for the atrocity. The government followed up by setting up an official inquiry into the massacre, which the Akalis under Master Mota Singh had boycotted from the get-go. The Central Sikh League instead set up a parallel non-official commission, which Gandhi had promised to lead. The public mourning and outcry in the months which followed the Nankana Sahib massacre drove the Sikh masses further towards the nationalistic cause. There were widespread calls in Punjab for the Mahant's death penalty. The Mahant had been driven into exile. The atmosphere of open hostility against the British had amplified the divide within the SGPC between the reformers and pro-British voices like Sundar Singh Ramgarhia. The second SGPC election, which took place in mid-1921, after the Nankana Sahib massacre, all but handed control of the SGPC into that of the radicals, who favoured non-violent, non-cooperation with the British, shifting from the SGPC's position in the late 1920s at their inception. The SGPC's position now aligned more closely with the Akali Dal. In the October of 1921, the radicals within the SGPC demanded for the keys to the Darbar Sahib treasury, the Toshkhana, which held the Gurdwara's historic jewels, gems and artefacts. The keys had been in possession of Sundar Singh Ramgarhia, who continued as the government-appointed manager of the shrine. He was also the first secretary of the SGPC at its inception. Growing increasingly worried, the government preemptively outflanked the radicals and obtained the keys from Sundar Singh Ramgarhia. The keys were now in the possession of the Deputy Commissioner of Amritsar, which symbolised full government control over the historical Sikh treasury. The DC of Amritsar, prior to the formation of the SGPC, then too had charge of the shrine, with the Mahant or manager underneath him. These proceedings further inflamed Sikh hatred for the regime, sparking a whole new series of non-violent, non-cooperation agitations, spearheaded by the Akalis. In this period, radical speeches saw the arrests of prominent Akali and SGPC leaders under the Seditious Meetings Act. In protest, the Golden Temple and many of Punjab's Gurdwaras remained dark on Guru Nanak Dev Ji's Gurpurab in 1921. Akalis went as far as issuing orders from the Akal Takhat, encouraging Sikhs to give up their military service. Threatened by the momentum the Akalis had gained, the government arrested 6 prominent Akali leaders just before they were about to deliver a speech. The Akalis responded by calling for divans across Punjab. Growing increasingly anxious over the civil unrest in Punjab, the government cancelled the Prince of Wales' visit to Amritsar after the Akalis demanded for the Sikhs to boycott his visit. Amar Singh Jabbal, who was then the acting head of the SGPC, was soon arrested, and so too was Master Tara Singh. Extreme sentences were issued, but this had the reverse effect of invigorating the movement, and CID reports now commented on how the Akalis were fast gaining popularity in the countryside too. On the December of 1921, the SGPC issued an ultimatum stating that no Sikh should agree to any arrangement about the restoration of the keys unless and until all the Sikhs arrested in connection with the keys affair are released unconditionally. The government finally conceded to the pressure in January of 1922 and issued what they called a final withdrawal from the administration of the affairs of Darbar Sahib, and all those detained over their protests over the keys were unconditionally released. The Deputy Commissioner and Manager control over the shrine were therefore removed, and this paved the way for full SGPC authority over the shrine. The SGPC leadership went as far as refusing to collect the keys from the DC and instead demanded that they be delivered to them for a divan which was set up to celebrate their success. Gandhi famously delivered a telegram to Khadak Singh, SGPC president, with the remarks, "First battle for India's freedom won. Congratulations." This was a high point of Gandhi's relations with the Akalis, a relationship which would soon begin to sour. The Babbar Akalis were a group frustrated with the Gandhian methods of non-violence. They instead saw militancy as a righteous means of ridding the Mahants and the British. The Babbars wanted to start an uprising in British Punjab and eliminate all those who they saw as enemies of the Khalsa Panth. They regarded a policy of undergoing inhuman punishments and courting arrests as cowardice. As with all major groups during this period, they started their own newspaper, which was called the Babbar Akali Dal Akhbar. They had sprung from a cadre of former Gurdwarites. More details on the Gurdwarites can be found in our previous episode. As well as this, the group attracted demobilised British Indian Army soldiers. Several members also included passengers on board the Komagata Maru, including the famous Karam Singh Chingar. A judge wrote that the Babbars had advised the Hindus, Mohammedans and Sikhs to unite and organize insurrection, wield a sword, behead the tyrants, burn and plunder police stations and treasuries, and blow up the railway lines. Master Mota Singh, an armed Babbar Akali leader, also famously visited the northwest frontier province in order to obtain arms. Evidence suggests they peaked at around 500 members in total. One of the first meetings of the Babbar Akalis took place after the Nankana Sahib tragedy. The Babbar Akalis instead aimed to hold those responsible and planned to kill British Chief Minister King and Commissioner Bowring, the superintendent of the police, as well as all of the Mahants of Nankana. This also included Kartar Singh Bedi, Guru Khem Singh Bedi's nephew, as we've previously mentioned. They even went as far as wanting to assassinate Sundar Singh Majithia, who they saw as the torchbearer of moderate Sikhism. Their list of targets all formed a part of a resolution, and 7 revolvers were stolen from the Air Force Arsenal depot of Ambala cantonment. 2 Babbars, Bella Singh and Ganda Singh, who was tasked to kill Mr. Bowring, was found loitering near his bungalow while he happened to be away. They were immediately detained and tortured by the police. It was here under police torture where they revealed their plot, and a large number of high-profile Babbars were soon arrested. The Babbar Akalis were thus declared an unlawful group by the authorities, and rewards were promised for anyone who gave up the Babbars. Mainstream Akalis publicly outright condemned the Babbars, and the SGPC released official statements denouncing their calls for violence. The famous prosecutor of the Babbar Akalis, who was then in charge of the police force, Fazal Imam, conceded in his account that the SGPC never instigated or conspired with the Babbar Akalis. The Central Sikh League, who were then still the premier Sikh political party, also heavily denounced the Babbars. The Babbars responded by accusing the Akalis of collaborating with the British, and said that the Akalis had conspired with the British to release Akali prisoners, whilst giving the government a green light to execute the Babbars who were in prison. It's important to note that some Babbars still held good relations with the more radical Akali Dal leaders, including Sundar Singh Layalpuri and Sardal Singh. They instead attempted to persuade them to join their armed rebellion. The Babbars were intent on coercing, intimidating, and silencing the moderates within the SGPC and Akali Dal. Much like their Gurdwarite predecessors, British intelligence at the time saw the Babbar Akalis as being funded from overseas, and American and Canadian Sikhs were accused of sending large sums of money to sustain the Babbar effort in Punjab. The Babbars concerned the British more so than the Gurdwarites, who by contrast didn't invest as much effort in proselytizing to the rural masses. Worried about an insurgency, the British called for peace councils and Sudar committees. Aeroplanes scattered the countryside with counter-propaganda. In some of these leaflets, they made large claims about British rule being blessed by the Gurus themselves. The strategic allegiance between the British and many prominent village heads across the Punjab significantly weakened the Babbars' chances of finding safe havens. They nonetheless never shied away from holding conferences and making inflammatory speeches in the Jalandhar area, which had previously been Gurdwarite stronghold. The Babbars carried out a series of assassinations on Sikhs, who they saw as police informants in 1923. An official account observed that the number of village officials and other loyalists were in fear of their lives, and many of them expressed anxiety to resign their posts. The British responded by setting up a force, who were given a squadron of armoured vehicles to dismantle the apparatus of the Babbars. They were under the supreme command of Superintendent Sheikh Abdul Aziz, who raided 39 villages, which were seen as Babbar strongholds. An eyewitness, Sardar Tara Singh, commented that the police surround a village, arrest men, and release them. For the sake of a few persons, whole villages are besieged at night. The Babbars' resources were limited, and they largely relied on robberies, including plundering railway stations, to sustain their activities. At their peak, they could barely afford 150 pistols. Important Babbar leaders were slowly arrested, as police presence and news of their notoriety spread. Inside informants and CID infiltration was perhaps one of the biggest reasons for their demise. High-profile informants took out 2 leaders, Kishan Singh and later Karam Singh, and they were in turn assassinated by fellow members. A lack of support from the Akali Dal and the Indian National Congress, combined with a crackdown of the Babbars by the Maharaja of Patiala, also contributed to the group's eventual downfall. By mid-1924, all important Babbars had been arrested and imprisoned, with some later hanged. The total number of murders committed by the Babbar Akali stood at 147. Meanwhile, The Akali Dal, galvanized from the success of the Keys affair, turned their attention to Sundar Das Mahant of Guru Ka Bagh. Guru Ka Bagh, situated in the Amritsar district, was historically associated with a visit from Guru Tegh Bahadur in 1664. The Akalis claimed that Sundar Das, like the Mahants of Nankana Sahib, used the funds of the Gurdwara to maintain his lifestyle of extravagance. He was also documented in CID reports to have had a mistress. Concerned about the movement's momentum, the Mahant reached a compromise with the Akalis and signed a treaty in January 1921. In this treaty, he agreed to serve under an 11-man committee led by members of the SGPC. He also agreed to marry his mistress and take Khanderi Paul at the Akal Takhat. By the August of the same year, the SGPC effectively took control of the Gurdwara's management, as they'd accused the Mahant of breaking his promises and relapsing into his old ways. The land attached to the Gurdwara, however, also known as the Bagh or garden, was still under the ownership of the Mahant. On one occasion, the Gurdwara Sangat cut wood off a dry tree from the Bagh to help them light fire for langar. It is unclear whether it was the Mahant who took issue with this, or whether it was a plot which had been preconceived by the establishment, but 5 Akalis were arrested for property theft in August 1922. The SGPC argued that this sentence was part of a broader pre-planned conspiracy by the central government to curtail their emerging influence after the Keys affair, going as far up as the Home Secretary. In response, the Akalis recruited Jathas to pour in towards the Bagh. The strength of the Akali Jathas rose to 4,000, and the government declared assemblies unlawful. Those arriving were subject to police beatings, and several were said to be in a very serious condition, with many declared as unconscious. This continued for days, on the arrival of several waves of Jathas. This caught the attention of an American cinematographer, Mr. Verghese, who was able to capture the beatings of the protesters on film. The most notable quote on the protests at Guru Ka Bagh came from a Christian missionary, C.F. Andrews, who told the governor of Punjab that he had seen with his own eyes hundreds of Christs being crucified. He went on to describe the action of the regime as inhuman, brutal, foul, cowardly, and incredible to an Englishman, and a moral defeat of England. A CID report documents some lathi blows were given on the private parts of the Akalis, that this was done with considerable force and intentionally, and the kesh of the Akalis were pulled. Undeterred, the Akalis continued to send more waves of Jathas by the day, whilst Punjab's prisons were nearing full capacity. In the midst of the struggle, Jathedar Kishan Singh Gargaj of the Babbar Akalis wrote a letter to the SGPC president, urging the SGPC to take up the sword, feeling that all peaceful means had been exhausted. Many Akalis who had endured beatings at Guru Ka Bagh and had later suffered further violence in Attock jail went on to join the Babbars. The Viceroy and the Governor of Punjab and members of councils set up a meeting where the existing Sikh situation was their top priority. The Indian National Congress took full advantage of this and set up a subcommittee to investigate the affair. They published a damning report which documented the extent of the police's excesses. Congress heavyweight Madan Mohan Malviya continued visiting the Bagh. The tumultuous waves of protests came to an end with a settlement. A high-profile government engineer, Gangaram, leased the land from the Mahant. He in turn gave the Akalis a green light to cut the tree. A total of 5,000 Akalis were said to have been arrested by the end of the campaign, with many suffering major injuries. Gangaram's supposedly independent intervention allowed the government to save face. He came across as a figure who had intervened out of generosity for the Sikhs. It later came to light that he had instead been greatly assisted and encouraged in his efforts by the government. The government at the time went to great lengths to hide this. Thousands of Akali Jathas still remained in jails even after the protests came to an end. Gandhi's warmth for the Akalis was for all to see in the months after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. He formed an alliance with the Central Sikh League. Despite being a pacifist, he went as far as defending the Kirpan and famously stated that the sword is to the Sikh what the sacred thread is to the Brahmin. He further added, "As much as I abhor the possession or the use of arms, I cannot reconcile myself to the forcible prohibition." As we've covered so far, his support continued after the Nankana Sahib massacre and up until the Keys affair. In September 1923, the SGPC was declared as an unlawful institution by the government as they protested the deposition of Maharaja Ripu Daman Singh of Nabha. It was here where many Sikh leaders were charged with sedition against the King Emperor. In protest, the Akalis started an Akhand Path in Jaito, where Akalis were arrested by the authorities en masse. This led to 500 Akali Sikhs marching to Jaito from the Akal Takhat. A Jatha was fired upon, which invoked more Shahidi Jathas to march towards Jaito in large numbers. As with their previous agitations, the Akalis were keen to draw approval and support from mainstream Indian political figures. They appealed to the Mahatma on his release from prison in early 1924, and in response he only guaranteed support conditionally if his demands were met. He challenged the strength in numbers of the Akalis. Previously, though, he had admired the peaceful nature of the Akalis. He raised alarms now on how a large party going to take possession of a Gurdwara constituted a show of force. In response, the SGPC explained that they would not limit their number to 1 or 2 at most, due to the concept of Sangat within the Sikh fold. Further to this, the Mahatma wanted full assurance of non-violence, with a document signed by all the principal leaders of the SGPC. This may have been in the context of the recent alarm caused by the Babbar Akalis. It's also important to note a key difference in ideology of non-violence, which was that he took issue with the Akalis' demonstration of public passive suffering. Gandhi instead insisted on courting immediate arrest and abiding by the order of the authorities. The Akalis did not approve of this and likened their passive suffering to the Shahidi of Guru Arjan. Gandhi also wanted a guarantee that the movement was neither anti-Hindu nor anti any other race or creed. He sent a letter stating, "I learnt too that the Hindu temple within the precinct of the Golden Temple had been destroyed by the Akalis, and that the latter took their stand upon religion. In your letter, which you have promised, I would like you to please deal with all of these questions." The SGPC responded to his accusations by apologizing on behalf of what they called some misguided men, most probably Sikhs. They clarified that it wasn't a Hindu temple that was destroyed, but rather a Shiva Lingam image, and they confessed to have been intent on instead removing this democratically and in good faith by passing the image on to the Hindu community. They further stated that while we resent to be called idol breakers, we dare not be called idol erectors, and so they refused to reinstate the image of the Shiva Lingam. The SGPC further emphasized that on the same night 1,600 Akalis patrolled the streets of Amritsar, protecting the life and property of Hindus, and they hinted at their disappointment that Gandhi did not acknowledge this. Gandhi had previously consistently expressed his dislike of Sikhs being seen as a separate faith from Hinduism, and in 1921 he derided Sikh leaders for thinking that their religion was distinct. It was after 1923, however, where he came to be more vocal in his theological views on the Sikh faith, by calling all of the Sikh gurus Hindus, and he saw Sikhi as a form of Hindu reform, similar to Vaishnavism, coming well after Vedic Brahmanism. He is further quoted to have blamed the divide between Hindus and Sikhs on the British, and stated that this was poison spread by historian Thomas Macaulay. He also went on to compare the Guru Granth Sahib with the teachings of the Vedas. Another point he made in his set of conditions was that he wanted to confirm that the SGPC sought no desire for the establishment of Sikh Raj. In response to this, the SGPC affirmed that they were purely a religious body and had no desire for the establishment of a Sikh Raj, and they felt pained by having to even explain this to Gandhi. The idea of the SGPC wanting to establish Sikh Raj was also dismissed in later writings by prominent Akali Sardul Singh. The SGPC's response somewhat pleased Gandhi, and he reiterated that no community has shown so much bravery, sacrifice and skill in the prosecution of its object as the Akalis. No community has maintained the passive spirit so admirably as they. In December of 1924, he visited the Darbar Sahib complex, and on receiving a siropa, he encouraged Sikhs to free India, which he saw as the bigger Gurdwara. He advised the Akalis to dissociate religion with politics, and he did not see any value in Sikhs demanding the restoration of Maharaja Ripu Daman Singh's rule. With this in mind, he demanded that Sikhs should not protest against the removal of the Maharaja, which he saw as more of a Sikh-centric political affair, instead of an Indian nationalist one. He had also advised against using religious protests via either the Akhand Path or the Jaito Morcha to fulfill Sikh political ambitions, as he was desperate to separate the religious and the secular. The Maharaja of Nabha, Ripudaman Singh, who had been privately educated in his youth by leading Singh Sabha polymath Khan Singh Nabha, had grown up to become a prominent supporter of the Akali cause. As mentioned in the previous episode, in 1905 he famously supported the removal of idols from the Darbar Sahib complex, which were against the wishes of his father. He furthered Singh Sabha Sikhi by proposing the Anand Marriage Act of 1909. He, however, was unhappy that the British removed him from the committee before the passing of this act. Ripudaman thus formed the Central Khalsa Diwan, in opposition to Sundar Singh Majitia's more moderate Chief Khalsa Diwan. Within the Imperial Legislative Council of 1907 to 1908, he made allies with Indian nationalistic leaders and was known to have been sceptical of British rule. He was never enthusiastic about British involvement in the First World War. Within the years of the Akali movement, Sikh enlistment into the military had in fact decreased from 20% in 1914 to 13% in 1930, with a temporary ban which was placed on the recruitment of Sikh soldiers during this period. To note, the black Akali turban became a source of wide-scale protest within the British Indian Army ranks too, and disciplinary action is listed in sources for wearing this symbol of dissent. During his reign, Maharaja Ripudaman Singh financed many radical papers, including the Sikh Review, Panth Sevak, and the previously mentioned Khalsa Akhbar, all of whom were greatly critical of the moderate, loyalist Chief Khalsa Diwan leadership. Going against imperial customs, the Maharaja immersed himself with Akali politics. Defying aristocratic norms, he frequently donned the black Akali turban, and he slept on the floor on the anniversary of the Nankana Martyrs' Day, as many Akali Sikhs at the time did, at the behest of the SGPC's resolution in memory of the tragedy. Secret reports describe the Akalis attempting to project the Maharaja as the Jathedar of the Panth, which greatly worried the British. The state of Patiala and Nabha had previously been on good terms with one another before the ascension of Maharaja Ripudaman Singh. A diplomatic feud between these two states had intensified, and it ultimately led to an informal complaint made by the Maharaja of Patiala against Maharaja Ripudaman Singh to the Secretary of State of India. These complaints were backed by allegations of his support for the Kukas and the Akalis, and it in turn led to the deposition of the Maharaja of Nabha. The Prime Minister of Patiala supposedly sent incriminating evidence to the British and accused Ripudaman of creating civil disobedience in Patiala via the use of Akali agents. The British had allegedly found important documentary evidence of Nabha's activities in relation to Akali sedition. This caused much alarm in the radical Sikh press, and Lord Peel noted that Maharaja is a big enough man to cause us a good deal of trouble, and added that this risk will be averted to a great extent if we can get him removed from the sphere of Sikh politics suddenly by his own act. The Maharaja abdicated his royal position in July 1923, and his minor son ascended to the throne in his place. Ripudaman Singh was exiled to Dehradun. Akali leaders responded by saying, "There is good reasons to believe that the abdication of the Maharaja was not voluntary, but extorted by official pressure." At this stage, the SGPC were divided on how best to respond. They were reluctant to commence another agitation, as this was more of a political issue instead of a matter pertaining to the ownership of Gurdwaras, a sentiment which was shared by Gandhi. Master Tara Singh, however, strongly stirred emotion within the ranks of the SGPC by drawing comparisons between the Maharaja of Nabha and the fall of Maharaja Dalip Singh. The SGPC thus voted for action in aid of Ripudaman Singh. The British immediately clamped down on all political meetings within the state of Nabha, whilst the Akalis continued to hold their divans. This spurred the Jeto Diwan, which was then indefinitely extended by the Akalis. An Akhand Path commenced in Jeto Gurdwara, and days later, on September the 14th, the military arrested all the Sangat, including the Granthi, who was the reader of the Akhand Path. In the coming days, Akali Jathas marched from the Akal Takhat towards Jeto, demanding their right to worship freely in all Gurdwaras. Despite Gandhi's skepticism, the Congress Akali coalition strengthened in this period, and the Morcha was supported by Dr. Kichlu, Congress's rising star Jawaharlal Nehru, who would go on to become India's first Prime Minister, also courted arrest here and issued a statement from prison in praise of the Akalis. The government declared the SGPC and all Jathas of the Akalis as unlawful for the first time on October the 12th in 1923. All 60 members of the executive committee were charged with treason to the King Emperor, and the Viceroy remarked at how he had been suspicious from the start that the Akali movement had not only been a religious movement, but also a political one too. Going against the authorities, the SGPC attempted to have an illegal meeting inside the Akal Takhat. Bhai Jodh Singh had blocked the entrance to the Bunga, preventing the authorities from entering. The SGPC committee later came out to court arrest following the police providing a list of wanted names. A government telegram later admitted that the forcible entry would have resulted in bloodshed. Whilst the SGPC leadership was in prison, moderate Sikh leaders found it difficult to discuss the situation pertaining to the fallen Maharaja in the Punjab Legislative Assembly, as more often than not, it was regarded as a Nabha state issue instead of a Punjab problem. Akali Jathas, despite being declared unlawful, continued to flood Jeto, receiving arrests and beatings as they drew closer to the site of the Nabha Gurdwara. On the third anniversary of the Nankana Sahib massacre, a Jatha of 500 attempted to perform a do or die Akantapad. Another massacre erupted, leading to 300 casualties, with reported deaths ranging from 70 to 150. Whilst a whole array of eyewitnesses attested to the non-violent nature of the Akalis, the Nabha authorities by contrast claimed that the firing had instead been started by a member of the Jatha. The official British inquiry supported this verdict. The Akalis prepared to send another Jatha to Jeto, but before doing so they discussed the idea of shifting their strategy back to religious demands by demanding a Gurdwara bill in place of their political demands of restoring Ripu Daman, right to the throne of Nabha. The Governor-General of Punjab was open to negotiating a settlement with the Akali leaders, including the ones who were behind bars. Though Akali leadership was polarised, some were open to the idea of separating the restoration of Maharaja Ripu Daman Singh with their original motives of freeing all Punjab's Gurdwaras from Mahant rule. It is possible that they thought it was an opportune moment to divert the momentum of the Dharam Morcha to a cause which was more in tune to their original aims. Sir William Birdwood, who had spent 35 years of his life in the Indian Army and had come to have known Sikhs well, came to lead these negotiations via the Birdwood Committee. These negotiations soon broke down, where Sir William accused extremists amongst the Akalis for setting unreasonable demands, which included the release of all Akali imprisoned, up to and including those who were even on trial for manslaughter. This sentiment had been shared by more moderate SGPC members, including Sardar Raja Singh, who resigned from the SGPC committee in protest. By contrast, the Shiromani Akali Dal accused the government of being untrustworthy and inconsistent for having materially changed its policy during the course of these negotiations. The issue would return a year later as events in Jeto continued, where Congress heavyweight Pandit Mohan Malviya proposed a new solution to the Sikhs, which would instead use the Punjab Council. In dialogue with the Akalis, he drafted a bill on lines more favourable to the Sikhs. He then persuaded Hindus of the Punjab Council to support Sikhs in the proposal of this new bill, and received backing from Jinnah too. Moderate Akalis in the council supported this, and eventually Governor-General Haley agreed to give a green light to this legislation. The act was implemented on the 1st of November in 1925. In an earlier session in the Punjab Legislative Council of 1925, the scale of unrest over the last 5 years was brought to light. Taking into account all the combined protests, including Tarantaran, Nankana Sahib and Jeto, a total of 400 Akalis were killed, 2,000 were wounded, and the Akalis had accumulated a fine of over 15 lakh rupees. The Sikh Gurdwara Act of 1925 came to be, which transferred control of Punjab's Gurdwaras onto the SGPC. The Khalsa under the SGPC now had a government mandate to rule over Punjab's Gurdwaras. And with this, the Udasis, Nirmalas, Sevapanthis, Namtaris and Nirankaris were now seen as offshoot sects. A central SGPC board was established, along with a new SGPC committee, a tribunal, and a commission. And it was ultimately the tribunal who had the final say as to whether a property belonged to it or not. Day-to-day control of Punjab's Gurdwaras was now under the administration of the committee and the board. General Haley reluctantly acknowledged its passing, fearing that a large central Sikh body could always be liable to misuse for political purposes, and had instead preferred Sikh Gurdwaras to be managed by smaller local committees. As mentioned in our first episode, religious syncretism had already been in decline ever since the beginning of the Singh Sabhas in the 1870s. However, this was now a pivotal moment where many Udasi establishments finalised their separation from the new canon of mainstream Sikhi, which emerged with the triumph of the SGPC. Many Gurdwaras under the Udasi's possession chose not to define themselves as Gurdwaras to evade capture from the SGPC's tribunal. They instead turned into private properties or were driven further towards Hinduism. 1925 solidified the crystallization of religious boundaries between Hindus and Sikhs, as the Act defined Sikhs as those who believed in the Guru Granth Sahib, the 10 Gurus, and no other religion. Sejdaris, including the Udasis and Nirmalas, were heavily against the final declaration of professing no other religion, and so became further marginalized from mainstream Sikh circles. Different Nirmala-inspired Sampardas came to accept the modern Sikh fold under different newly established Jathebandis, like the Nanaksaris and the Damdami Taksal, who we have covered in our 4th episode. These Sampardas, though very Nirmala in their outlook and philosophy, took the 5 Ks and the Sikh symbolism, which was set by the SGPC. Crucially, however, orthodox Sejdaris, accepting this definition, were incorporated within the wider Panth, which more radical elements like Teja Singh Passaud were thoroughly against. His definition of a Sikh, as seen in our previous episode, was only those who were Amritdhari, with absolutely no space for any Sejdaris at all. A schism between the radicals and the moderates within the SGPC emerged very soon after the passing of the Gurdwara Act. The more moderate Akali Mehtab Singh had accepted his conditional release from prison, along with other moderates who took control of the SGPC in January 1926. These moderates accepted their release from prison in order to secure the terms of the Gurdwara Act through the British. Mehtab Singh's victory, however, was short-lived, and a few months later, the SGPC contested another election where the more radical faction of the Akali Dal, who had by now been released from prison, emerged as the most popular faction, securing 85 out of the 120 contested seats within the SGPC's elections. On their victory, the radicals within the Akali Dal appointed the imprisoned Sardar Khadak Singh as the new president of the SGPC. The younger Master Tara Singh, whose popularity soared within the years of agitation, was appointed as the vice president. He nonetheless effectively took control of the committee, while Sardar Khadak Singh remained in jail. This new SGPC committee, now led by the Akali Dal, was keen to show itself as a body which concerned itself with more than just the upkeep and maintenance of Punjab's Gurdwaras. The new committee soon passed a resolution underlining that Sikhs would never be at peace until all prisoners from 1913 onwards, connected with the Gurdwara reform movement, were released and compensated for the losses they had suffered. In 1927, the SGPC's edicts marked the triumph of the Singh Sabha Lahore's ideology over all of Punjab's main Gurdwaras. The SGPC soon set up a subcommittee for the formalisation of a new Rehat Maryada for the Sikhs, which brought together heavyweight Singh Sabha scholars, including Bhai Khan Singh Nabha and Bhai Veer Singh. Hukamnamas were also issued from the Akal Takhat, denouncing caste divisions, and local committees were encouraged to promote competent Singhs from lower castes in positions of leadership. This Maryada produced a scholarly consensus across different groups based on older texts. Aside from the formalised SGPC Maryada, an interesting early source shows the widespread scale of changes the Singh Sabha and the Akali movement brought about. It describes the removal of dancing girls, alcohol, caste divisions, and female equality extending to their taking of Khande di Paul and wearing turbans. The wearing of turbans amongst females became a formal part of the Panch Khalsa Diwan and later the AKJ. There was divided opinion within the SGPC on the status of Teja Singh Passaud of the Panch Khalsa Diwan, discussed in depth in our previous episode, who was the leader of one of the most crucial Singh Sabha ideologies during this period. He was accused of having changed Amrit ceremonies and Gurbani and producing false courses, books and publications. In 1928, the SGPC publicly excommunicated Teja Singh Passaud from the Panth. The alliance between Sardar Khadak Singh as the president and Master Tara Singh as the second in command lasted up until 1932. Later in life, Sardar Khadak Singh instead became more embedded within Indian nationalist politics, believing that the bigger Gurdwara, in reference to the Indian subcontinent as a whole, still needed liberating. Many progressives who had established themselves within the Akali Dal during the years of agitation also later went on to join radical Marxist groups, including the Naujawan Bharat Sabha. Some years later, the Akali Dal evolved from an agitation movement led by various jathedars to becoming a formalized Sikh interest political party after 1930, superseding the already established Central Sikh League. They thus not only competed within the SGPC elections, but also contested elections within the secular sphere of politics, both on a Punjab state level and on a national level for votes, forming various governments at different periods in Punjabi history. To fast forward in time, the SGPC today is the most powerful institution within the Sikh faith and is regarded by many as the most important non-government, bureaucratic organisation within Punjab. Some scholars go as far as describing the SGPC as a state within a state. The committee maintains control over Punjab, Himachal Pradesh and Chandigarh's main Gurdwaras. At present, the size of its General House, or Parliament, stands at 179 members, of which 159 members are elected in elections which are supposed to happen every 5 years. Harjinder Singh Dhammi is currently the president of the SGPC, leading a 15-member executive committee. Around 52 lakh Sikh voters from all across Punjab registered to vote in 2011, a figure which is expected to reduce following a recent amendment precluding Sajdari Sikhs the right to vote. Since the SGPC's inception, the Shiromani Akali Dal has consistently won all of SGPC elections in a landslide. Interestingly, Sant Jarnail Singh Pindranwale fielded his own candidates in the SGPC election in 1979, in the immediate aftermath of the feud between the Nirankaris and the Sikhs. Despite riding the wave of populism, Pindranwale's representatives only gained 4 seats, despite winning 21% of the popular vote within certain constituencies. This was all the while the Akali Dal won 133 seats out of 140. Much like the first-past-the-post parliamentary system in the UK, it seems as though the election system of the SGPC clearly favours the most established political parties. Except in this case, there is only one dominant Sikh party. That being said, like all parties, the Akali Dal within the SGPC have never been a unified hegemony. Many non-dominant and dissident voices within the General House act as pressure groups against the President's Executive Committee. The Shiromani Akali Dal today competes on all fronts of both the religious and secular sphere of politics, and because the Akali Dal is stretched between the SGPC elections, the Punjab state elections, as well as the Indian national elections, the party tries to appeal to an electorate which is broader than just its Amritdhari and Keshdhari Sikh core. In order to achieve a majority within the Punjab State Legislative Assembly, the Akali Dal has almost always had to form a coalition government with another party. This has historically often been the BJP. Because of this, their ideology and commitment to what are seen as Sikh demands is often moderated. This has historically often put the Akali leaders who operate within the secular sphere of mainstream politics at odds with populist and more radical figures who emerge within the Sikh space, who instead only rely on preaching to a Sikh core. This has historically also created degrees of friction between Akali politicians who are in power within the secular sphere of Indian politics and the more radical Akali figures who are instead found operating closer to the innermost religious sphere. This became especially apparent on the build-up to Operation Blue Star and later the Sikh separatist insurgency. In the aftermath of the Sikh separatist insurgency, Prakash Singh Badal declared the Akali Dal as a secular Punjabiyat party, marking its departure from Sikh nationalism. His statement in retrospect cannot be entirely taken at face value, as the Akali Dal still remained embedded within the SGPC. The party has since earned the reputation of being a Badal family-run dynasty. With all this in mind, the 4 most powerful figures in Panthic politics stand as the president of the Akali Dal party, the president of the SGPC, the leader of the Akali Dal's legislators in the different legislative assemblies, and the SGPC appointed Jathedar of the Akal Takhat. Because the Akal Takhat Jathedar is appointed by an Akali Dal committee within the SGPC, one could argue that the Akal Takhat Jathedar is subservient to the interests of the Akali Dal party and not the Guru Panth as a whole. But equally, one could also make the case that the SGPC, as a democratic institution, can serve as a representative voice for the Guru Panth at large, and so those who are elected in by a Sikh constituency are in a reasonable position to determine who the next Jathedar of the Akal Takhat should be. Recent politics has shown that the relationship between the Akal Takhat Jathedar and the Akali Dal is a more complex one than that of complete subservience, as it was the Akal Takhat Jathedar who mandated a punishment to Sukhbir Badal, which Badal accepted. Despite the power struggles between the religious and the secular domains of Akali politics, both sides have used one another symbiotically to advance their own interests. The right the Akal Takhat Jathedar has to act as the spiritual leader of the Panth, or as many would informally call the Sikh Pope, is a contested one. As the SGPC has control over Punjab's historical Gurdwaras, the present centralisation of Sikh politics has afforded the Akal Takhat Jathedar with more symbolic power than ever before. It is unclear how much agency the position of the Akal Takhat Jathedar had historically before the position became more formalised by the SGPC. Interestingly, Bhai Gurmukh Singh of the Lahore Singh Sabha, who in many ways can be regarded as the godfather of modern-day Sikhism, was famously excommunicated by the Pujaris who were in control of the Akal Takhat in the late 1800s, as we covered in our previous episode. It is unclear how much weight the verdict of the Akal Takhat would have had at the time, relative to what it now has. Whilst Gurmukh Singh's ideology posthumously triumphed and came to dominate the Akal Takhat some decades later, one could argue that the modern-day SGPC and Akali Dal aren't as committed to the Lahore Singh Sabha's Sikh cause as they were to begin with. The Sikh separatist insurgency led to the rise of the modern Jathebandiyan, like Damdami Taksal, and these Jathebandis lean more heavily towards Nirmala teachings than Singh Sabha Lahore Sikhi. In the aftermath of the insurgency, the modern SGPC has shown limited pushback against the ideologies of these Jathebandiyan. The SGPC, to some extent, acts as an evolving Sikh Parliament, and so absorbs and adopts many of these popular religious currents into its own religious and political praxis. Modern Sikh thought today in the 21st century is in many ways an ideological hybrid between Singh Sabha Lahore Sikhi and the Sikhi of the Nirmala-inspired Sampardas like Damdami Taksal. The SGPC Akal Takhat Maryada, which was very much the product of the Lahore Singh Sabha, still stands to this day. It is now, however, administered much less in modern-day Amrit Sanchars, in place of the Maryada of popular Jathebandiyan like the Damdami Taksal, Akhand Kirtani Jatha, Nanaksar, and even the Buddha Dal. This is especially common in the diaspora in particular, where the SGPC's control over Gurdwaras is limited. Gurdwaras today in the UK, which have the title of Singh Sabha, most usually don't administer the Akal Takhat Rahat Maryada for Amrit Sanchars. Overall, since their founding, the SGPC and the Akali Dal have played a consequential role in mobilising the Sikh masses throughout the 20th century, as was seen during the Gurdwara Reform Movement, India's independence movement, the partition, the Punjabi Suba, and towards Operation Blue Star with the Dharam Yudh Morcha. Despite Sikhs being a relatively small population, the power both these institutions hold has in many ways allowed Sikhs to politically punch above their weight in modern democratic India. Equally, the SGPC as a democratic body can also be vulnerable to the same predicaments which affect South Asian politics at large. This includes the likelihood of corruption, the rise of nepotism and family politics, powerful egos, as well as inherent contradictions between the interests of the religious and the secular spheres of party politics. As with all institutions and structures of state, their effectiveness and credibility may have weakened over time, as was reflected in the most recent Punjab elections, where the Akalis only gained 1 seat in the Lok Sabha and 3 in the Punjab State Assembly. Both bodies may have been founded by an ideologically zealous core, but many decades later, they may well be seeing signs of fatigue and decadence, with a potential need for reform. The role both institutions should have in the future of Panthic politics is ultimately for you, the viewer, to decide. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. We're also on Instagram at Khalsanama Productions, so please do give us a follow. The full list of academic sources have been given in the description below for reference. We've also started a Patreon if you'd like to donate and support this project.